Thomas was a young vibrant man with big dreams and even bigger determination. After completing his National Youth Service Corps (NYC) program, he was eager to make a mark in the world. Luck, coupled with hard work, smiled on him when he landed a job with a top company in Abuja. The job came with a good salary, and within 2 years, Thomas's life transformed completely. He moved into a beautiful house in the government-reserved area (GRA) of the city, a place reserved for the wealthy and successful. He also bought 2 sleek cars, each one shining like a trophy. Thomas was proud of what he had achieved. People admired him wherever he went, and many called him a role model. Deep inside, though, Thomas enjoyed the attention and the power his success gave him. Among the many people who admired Thomas was Christiana, a kind and beautiful woman who had caught his eye. Christiana was different from the others Thomas had met. She wasn't just beautiful, she was warm, supportive, and always believed in him. They started dating, and soon Christiana moved in with him. To Christiana, Thomas was the man of her dreams. He treated her well, bought her gifts, and always reassured her that their future was bright. She was sure he would marry her someday. Thomas, however, didn't share the same thoughts. He cared about Christiana, but deep down he wasn't ready for marriage or settling down. To him, life was about having fun, enjoying his wealth, and living each day as it came. Still, things seemed perfect between them. Christiana cooked for Thomas, helped him organize his home, and made sure he felt loved. She didn't know that Thomas had a secret side, a side that loved the thrill of chasing other women. He was careful, though. He made sure Christiana never suspected anything. To everyone outside, they looked like the perfect couple. Time passed, and their relationship grew stronger, or so Christiana thought. They had been living together for 3 years, sharing dreams and laughter. But in Thomas's mind, Christiana was only part of the life he wanted to live, not his whole future. One day, Christiana asked Thomas, "Do you ever think about getting married? About starting a family?" Thomas smiled and changed the subject. "Let's not rush things," he said. "We have time." Christiana trusted his words, not knowing that Thomas was more interested in enjoying his freedom than in building a future with her. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until one fateful night. Thomas and his closest friend, Stephen, decided to hang out at a popular bar in the city. It was a lively place, filled with music, laughter, and people dressed in their best. As they sat at the bar, sipping their drinks and joking about work, Thomas noticed someone. Across the room was a woman so beautiful that she seemed to shine brighter than the lights in the bar. Her name was Angelina. She had smooth skin, long flowing hair, and a smile that could make anyone stop and stare. Thomas was immediately drawn to her. Without a second thought, he walked over to where she sat. "Hi, I'm Thomas," he said, flashing his most charming smile. Angelina looked up, curious and amused. "Nice to meet you, Thomas," she replied. They started talking, and within minutes, Thomas was completely captivated. Angelina was confident, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in him. They laughed, shared stories, and before the night was over, Thomas had her phone number saved in his contact list. He couldn't stop smiling as he left the bar that night. When Thomas got home, Christiana was waiting for him. She had prepared his favorite meal, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. "How was your night out?" she asked. "It was fine," Thomas said casually, hiding the excitement he felt from meeting Angelina. Little did Christiana know the man she loved was already thinking about someone else. Thomas's life was about to take a new turn, and everything he had built with Christiana was hanging by a thread. Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Angelina. Her laughter echoed in his mind, and her face appeared in his thoughts constantly. Though he was still living with Christiana, his attention began to shift. He started messaging Angelina often, their conversations growing longer and more personal. She was exciting, new, and offered him a thrill that he hadn't felt in a long time. At first, Thomas told himself that it was harmless. He was just talking to Angelina. It didn't mean anything serious. But the more they talked, the more he realized he wanted to see her again. So he began making excuses to leave the house. "I have a late meeting," he would tell Christiana, or, "I'm going to hang out with Stephen." Christiana trusted him completely, never questioning where he was going or who he was with. Soon, Thomas and Angelina started meeting regularly. They went out to fancy restaurants, attended parties, and even spent quiet evenings together at her apartment. Thomas showered her with gifts, jewelry, designer bags, and anything she desired. He enjoyed the way Angelina made him feel like he was the center of her world. Despite this new relationship, Thomas made sure to keep his life with Christiana intact. He continued to provide for her, buying her things and spending time with her when he could. To him it was a delicate balancing act. He thought he could have it all: a stable relationship with Christiana at home and an exciting romance with Angelina on the side. But things started to unravel. One evening, as Thomas was getting ready to leave the house, Christiana stopped him. "Thomas, you've been going out a lot lately," she said softly. "Is everything okay?" Thomas froze for a moment but quickly recovered. "Of course everything's fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Work has just been demanding lately. I'll be home early, I promise." Christiana nodded, though she still felt uneasy. She loved Thomas deeply and trusted him, but something about his recent behavior didn't feel right. Still, she chose to ignore her doubts, convincing herself that Thomas was just busy with work. That night, while Thomas was out with Angelina, Christiana sat alone in the living room, her hands resting on her stomach. She had been feeling strange lately, tired, emotional, and nauseous. After some hesitation, she decided to take a pregnancy test. When the result came back positive, her heart raced. She was going to have a baby, Thomas's baby. Excited and nervous, Christiana stayed up waiting for Thomas to return home. When he finally walked through the door, she ran to him, her face glowing. "Thomas, I have something to tell you," she said, holding his hands. "What is it?" he asked, surprised by her enthusiasm. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling with joy. Thomas's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of smiling or hugging her, his face turned cold. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "How could this happen?" Christiana's heart sank. "What do you mean? We've been together for years. Isn't this a good thing?" Thomas stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Christiana, I'm not ready for this," he said. "I told you I didn't want anything serious right now, and a baby is definitely serious." Tears filled Christiana's eyes. "But Thomas, we've been together for so long. I thought we were building a future together." Thomas shook his head. "I can't do this," he said firmly. "I'm not ready to be a father. This isn't what I want." The argument escalated, with Christiana begging Thomas to reconsider and Thomas growing more frustrated. Finally, in a fit of anger, he shouted, "You need to leave. I can't deal with this right now." Christiana was stunned. She packed her things that night, tears streaming down her face as she left the home they had shared. She felt betrayed and heartbroken, carrying the weight of Thomas's rejection and her unborn child. Meanwhile, Thomas threw himself deeper into his relationship with Angelina. He convinced himself that Christiana's pregnancy wasn't his responsibility and that he deserved to be happy. Angelina, unaware of what had happened, welcomed him with open arms. She was everything Thomas thought he wanted: beautiful, confident, and carefree. As months passed, Thomas and Angelina grew closer. She introduced him to her friends and family, and they began talking about their future together. Thomas felt like he had left all his problems behind, but deep down, a part of him couldn't forget the pain he had caused Christiana. Little did he know, the choices he had made were about to catch up with him in ways he couldn't imagine. After Christiana left, Thomas felt a strange sense of relief. He told himself he had done the right thing. He wasn't ready for a family and he deserved to live his life the way he wanted. With Christiana gone, Thomas poured all his energy into his relationship with Angelina. She was his escape, his new beginning, and he was determined to make things work with her. Angelina was thrilled with how much attention Thomas gave her. He took her on exotic trips, bought her expensive gifts, and introduced her to his circle of friends. To everyone around them, they looked like the perfect couple. But Thomas knew deep down that his life was far from perfect. Though he tried to push Christiana out of his mind, he couldn't forget the look on her face when he told her to leave. Sometimes, late at night, he would think about her and wonder if she was okay. But he quickly buried those thoughts, telling himself that Christiana was strong and would figure things out on her own. As time went on, Thomas's relationship with Angelina grew more serious. After a year and 6 months of dating, Thomas decided it was time to take the next step. One evening, while they were having dinner at an upscale restaurant, he pulled out a small velvet box and placed it on the table. "Angelina," he said, his voice filled with charm, "you've made me happier than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me?" Angelina gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, Thomas, of course," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. The other diners clapped and Thomas felt a surge of pride. He had made his choice and he was ready to move forward with his new life. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Angelina was excited, picking out the perfect dress, selecting flowers and planning every detail. Thomas, meanwhile, felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He had never imagined himself getting married, but he convinced himself that this was the right thing to do. On the morning of the wedding, Thomas stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit. Stephen, his best man, clapped him on the shoulder. "You're finally doing it, man," Stephen said with a grin. "I never thought I'd see the day." Thomas laughed, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, me neither," he replied. The ceremony was held at a grand church, filled with friends, family, and colleagues. Angelina looked stunning as she walked down the aisle, her white dress sparkling under the light. Thomas couldn't help but admire her beauty, but a nagging feeling in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. As the pastor began the vows, Thomas tried to focus. Everything was going smoothly until the pastor reached the part of the ceremony where he asked, "If there is anyone here who has any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The room was silent. The pastor repeated the question a second time. Still no one spoke. But on the third time the doors to the church swung open and a gasp rippled through the crowd. Everyone turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, holding the hand of a small boy. It was Christiana. Thomas's heart sank as he locked eyes with her. She looked different, stronger, more confident, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. The boy by her side had Thomas's eyes, his nose, his entire face. There was no mistaking it. This was his son. Christiana walked down the aisle, her steps steady and determined. The crowd whispered in shock, and Angelina's smile faded as confusion spread across her face. When Christiana reached the altar, she looked directly at Thomas. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I can't stay silent. Thomas, this is your son. You might have forgotten about us, but I haven't." The room fell into stunned silence. Thomas felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. Angelina's face turned pale, and then she fainted, collapsing into the arms of her bridesmaids. The chaos that erupted at the church was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. Christiana's sudden appearance, the sight of the boy who so clearly resembled him, and Angelina's collapse had turned what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life into a nightmare. As the guests whispered and murmured, trying to piece together what had just happened, Thomas stood frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind was racing but no clear thoughts formed. Christiana stood near the altar, holding her son's hand firmly. Her eyes were locked on Thomas, unyielding and filled with a mixture of pain and determination. The church staff quickly helped Angelina onto a stretcher, and she was rushed to the hospital. Thomas followed her without a word, leaving behind a room full of confused guests and a devastated Christiana. At the hospital, Thomas sat anxiously in the waiting room. Stephen, who had driven him there, paced back and forth. "Thomas, what were you thinking?" Stephen finally said, his voice low but sharp. "How could you not tell Angelina about Christiana or your child? You've made a mess of everything." Thomas buried his face in his hands, unable to respond. He had no answers, no excuses. All he could feel was the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a boulder. After what felt like hours, the doctor came out. "She's awake," he said. "You can see her now, but please keep it brief. She needs rest." Thomas nodded and walked into the room. Angelina was lying in the hospital bed, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She turned her head away when she saw him. "Angelina," Thomas began, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." She didn't respond. The silence was unbearable, but Thomas continued. "I should have told you about Christiana and my son. I didn't handle things the right way and I know I've hurt you deeply. Please, just give me a chance to explain." Angelina finally turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "Explain? What's there to explain, Thomas? You lied to me, you betrayed me. You hid something this big from me and you brought it all crashing down on our wedding day." Thomas struggled to find the right words. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I made mistakes, but I love you, Angelina. I want to fix this." Angelina shook her head. "Fix this? How? You've betrayed my trust. How do we move forward from here?" Thomas had no answer. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the pain he had caused. He knew that whatever happened next, things would never be the same. Meanwhile, Christiana waited outside the hospital, unsure of what to do next. She hadn't come to ruin Thomas's wedding. That wasn't her intention. But as the years had passed and her son grew older, she realized he deserved to know his father. She hadn't expected to feel so nervous, but walking into that church and seeing Thomas again had brought back all the pain and heartbreak she had tried so hard to bury. Her son, David, tugged at her hand. "Mommy, are we going home now?" he asked innocently. Christiana knelt down and looked into his eyes. "Not yet, sweetheart. I just need to talk to someone first, okay?" David nodded, trusting his mother completely. Moments later, Stephen stepped outside and saw them. He approached cautiously, his expression serious. "Christiana," he said, "we need to talk." Christiana straightened up, her face calm but guarded. "What is there to talk about, Stephen? Thomas has a son and he needs to take responsibility. That's all I came to say." Stephen sighed. "I understand, but you should know that things are complicated. Thomas has made mistakes, and this situation, it's not easy for anyone." Christiana's eyes hardened. "It wasn't easy for me either, Stephen. Raising a child on my own with no support wasn't easy. But I did it because I had no choice. Thomas made his decisions and now he has to face the consequences." Stephen nodded. "Fair enough. Just give him a chance to sort this out. He's in there with Angelina right now trying to fix things with her." Christiana's heart ached. She didn't want to ruin Thomas's life, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that their son deserved to have a father. Later that evening, a family meeting was hastily arranged at Thomas's house. Both Thomas's and Angelina's families were present, along with Christiana and David. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Thomas stood at the center of the room, his head bowed. He had never felt so ashamed. His mother, a stern but caring woman, was the first to speak. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm, "what have you done? How could you let things get this bad?" Thomas looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I made mistakes, Mom. I let my selfishness take over and I hurt the people I care about most. I don't have any excuses." Angelina, sitting on the couch with her parents, didn't say a word. Her mother, however, was livid. "You betrayed my daughter, Thomas," she said angrily. "How do you expect her to move past this? How do you expect her to trust you again?" Christiana, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "I didn't come here to destroy Thomas's life or his relationship with Angelina. I came because my son deserves to know his father. That's all I want, for David to have the chance to know where he comes from." All eyes turned to David, who was sitting quietly beside Christiana, his small hands clutching hers. The boy looked around the room, confused by the tension but sensing that something important was happening. Thomas's heart broke as he looked at his son. For the first time he truly understood the gravity of his actions. He had been so consumed by his own desires that he had neglected the most important thing in the world: his responsibility as a father. "I'm sorry, Christiana," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for everything, for sending you away, for not being there for you and David. I want to make things right. I want to be a father to him if you'll let me." Christiana nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I ever wanted, Thomas." Angelina finally spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "Thomas, I don't know if I can forgive you. You've broken my heart and I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I need time to think." Thomas nodded. "Take all the time you need, Angelina. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm serious about fixing this." Angelina remained distant, but Thomas didn't give up. He knew it would take time to earn her forgiveness, but he was determined to show her that he had changed. For Christiana, life became a little brighter. She had spent so long carrying the weight of her struggles alone, but now she had hoped that her son would grow up knowing and bonding with his father. Thomas's journey was far from over, but for the first time in years he was determined to do the right thing, for himself, for Angelina, and for his son. The weeks following the disastrous wedding day were some of the most challenging in Thomas's life. He faced a storm of emotions, guilt, shame, and regret, but amidst the chaos he knew one thing for certain: he had to make things right. Not just for Angelina and Christiana, but most importantly for his son David. The first step in Thomas's journey of redemption was acknowledging the pain he had caused. He arranged a private meeting with Christiana to meet and discuss how they could co-parent David. They met at a quiet park one afternoon, where David could play nearby while they talked. Christiana was guarded, her arms crossed as she listened to Thomas. "I don't want empty promises, Thomas," she said firmly. "David doesn't need a father who shows up when it's convenient. If you're serious about being in his life, you have to prove it." Thomas nodded, understanding her skepticism. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said. "But I want to be there for David and for you in any way I can. I know I've failed you before, but I'm not going to fail again." Christiana softened slightly at his sincerity. "We'll see, Thomas. Actions speak louder than words." For the first time in years they shared a moment of understanding. Though the hurt from the past lingered, both agreed to focus on what mattered most, giving David the love and support he deserved. Building a relationship with David was no easy task. At 2 years old, the boy was curious but cautious around Thomas. Their initial meetings were awkward, with David clinging to Christiana and barely speaking to Thomas. Undeterred, Thomas began visiting regularly, bringing books, toys, and games that David liked. He made an effort to understand his son's interests, from his love of superheroes to his fascination with building blocks. Slowly but surely, David began to open up. One day, as they sat on the floor piecing together a massive puzzle, David looked up at Thomas and asked, "Why weren't you here before?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath and replied honestly, "I made mistakes, David. I wasn't ready to be a dad back then, but I'm here now and I promise I'll never leave you again." David studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said simply, and for Thomas that small word meant the world. While Thomas made progress with David, his relationship with Angelina remained strained. She had moved back to her parents' house after the wedding fiasco, refusing to speak to Thomas except through brief text messages. Thomas knew he couldn't force Angelina to forgive him, but he wasn't ready to give up. He began writing her letters, pouring his heart onto paper in a way he couldn't do in person. In each letter he apologized for his mistakes, acknowledged the pain he had caused, and expressed his hope for a second chance. At first Angelina didn't respond. But after weeks of persistence she finally agreed to meet him at a cafe. When Thomas arrived, she was already seated, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said as he sat down. Angelina nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you, Thomas. I just want to hear what you have to say." Thomas took a deep breath. "Angelina, I know I've hurt you in ways that words can't fix. I was selfish, reckless, and dishonest. You didn't deserve that, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." She listened silently, her face impassive. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight or even at all," Thomas continued. "But I love you and I want to show you that I can be the man you deserve. If you'll give me a chance, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." Angelina stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "Thomas, I don't know if I can trust you again. You broke my heart. But I can see that you're trying to change. Maybe, just maybe, we can start with friendship and see where that leads." Thomas nodded eagerly. "I'll take whatever chance you're willing to give me." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start, a fragile bridge that Thomas was determined to strengthen. As months passed, Thomas worked tirelessly to rebuild his life. He balanced his job, his growing bond with David, and his efforts to win back Angelina's trust. Slowly but surely, the pieces of his life began to fall into place. One sunny afternoon, Thomas organized a picnic at a nearby park, inviting both Christiana and Angelina. He wanted to create a space where everyone could come together for David's sake. Though hesitant at first, both women agreed. The day was filled with laughter as David ran around, playing soccer with Thomas and showing off his new kite. Christiana and Angelina sat on the sidelines watching the scene unfold. "I never thought I'd see the day," Christiana said with a small smile. "Thomas actually acting like a responsible adult." Angelina chuckled. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" Though their shared history was complicated, the two women found common ground in their love for David and their cautious hope for Thomas's growth. By the end of the day, Thomas felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. For the first time it felt like his fractured life was beginning to heal. One evening, after dropping David off at Christiana's house, Thomas drove to Angelina's apartment. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks and he knew it was now or never. When Angelina opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. "Can I come in?" She hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Thomas took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "Angelina, I know I've made mistakes, big ones. But I've spent every day since the wedding trying to be better, not just for you but for David and myself. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a second chance. I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Angelina's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I've seen the effort you've made. I've seen how hard you've worked to fix things. And I think I'm ready to give us another chance." Thomas's heart soared. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close as relief and gratitude washed over him. A year later, Thomas stood at the altar once again, but this time things were different. The small, intimate wedding was filled with only close friends and family. Angelina walked down the aisle, radiant and smiling, while David stood beside Thomas as his ring bearer. As they exchanged vows, Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance. A chance to love, to grow, and to be the man he was always meant to be. After the ceremony, as the newlyweds danced with their guests, Christiana approached Thomas. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. "You've come a long way." "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Christiana smiled. "Just keep being a good father to David. That's all I ask." "I will," Thomas promised. As the night went on, Thomas looked around at his wife, his son, and the friends and family who had supported him. For the first time in years he felt whole. His journey had been difficult, filled with mistakes and heartbreak, but in the end he had found redemption. And he vowed never to take it for granted.